and what is not supposed to be content. But anyway, I'm going to go pee really quickly. This is a YouTube video that says anti-war films don't exist. Okay? I'm going to start this, and I'll be back in a second.
There's no such thing as an anti-war film. These are the words of François Truffaut, and there are different ways to interpret this remark, but it's widely agreed that Truffaut was suggesting that movies will inevitably glorify combat when they portray the adventure and thrill of conflict. When Truffaut made this comment, he was referring to Stanley Kubrick's 1957 film, Paths of Glory, which is considered by many as the greatest anti-war film ever made. But in the same interview, Truffaut continues this remark. I find that violence is very ambiguous in movies. For example, some films claim to be anti-war, but I don't think I've really seen an anti-war film. Every film about war ends up being pro-war. I love a lot of the films that Truffaut is talking about. But the strange thing is, I don't entirely disagree with what Truffaut is saying. If you look at the science behind war movies and the effect they have on our brain, Truffaut is actually right in a lot of ways. Regardless of genre or subject matter, at their core, all films are created as a form of entertainment, and our minds are consciously aware of that, but it still reacts. In a study conducted at Washington University regarding the psychology of movies, Professor Jeff Zaks states, "You know there is nothing up there on the screen that can touch you or hurt you or pull you out of your chair, but we react as if they can." This is where neurocinematics comes into the equation. Neurocinematics is an area of research that explores the impact of film on the human brain, combining insights from neuroscience, psychology, and film studies. A leader in this field of research is Yuri Hassan, whose work utilizes MRI scans to measure the brain activity of a subject whilst they view a movie.
This guy does actually sound like Nathan Fielder. Okay, but here's the thing. Okay? All Quiet on the Western Front is like a fantastic example. Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to say that it's not like or not All Quiet on the Western Front? Sorry. Zone of Interest is also another fantastic example. I wonder if it's because it doesn't feature any of the war aspect of the war itself that it actually is not considered like it actually has no. It's not a war movie. It's a movie about the Holocaust, but also without even showing the Holocaust at all.
Studies reveal that certain films can exert considerable control over brain activity, with the degree of influence varying based on the film's content, editing, and directing style, meaning that directors can literally influence how our brain is working through their filmmaking choices. Filmmaking is an art form that literally lives and dies through its choices. It's controlled entirely by the intent of the filmmakers. Everything that's put on screen is put there intentionally, and it's done so with the intent of creating an emotional response. Right now you may be freely looking around your room, out the window, or at your coffee cup on your desk. But in cinema, you can't do this. Everything we see is curated by a director. Every gunshot, every explosion, every drop of blood, and every tear is there because it was put there intentionally to elicit a response. And this is where we begin to enter a paradox. Because in the case of most anti-war films, the emotion that our brains respond with is adrenaline. The paradoxical effect anti-war films have on the human brain, particularly through the elicitation of adrenaline, underscores a complex psychological phenomenon. It's a strange thing, because even though these films aim to depict the horrors and futility of war, their intense and often graphic portrayals can inadvertently trigger the body's adrenaline response. This response, characterized by heightened physical and mental alertness, is not inherently negative. The rush of adrenaline, therefore, transforms a viewing experience into one of excitement and heightened engagement, regardless of a film's heavy subject matter. Consequently, an intended anti-war message may be overshadowed by the viewer's physiological and emotional response, illustrating the intricate interplay between film content, brain chemistry, and viewer perception.
I don't know. Like, so what is it? Is it that just like, if there's anything that tickles your brain receptors in a positive manner, or not even in a positive manner, but if there's anything in the fucking war movie that like pumps up your adrenaline, then automatically it's like, it's pro-war. Especially because for a war movie to like, regardless of its intentionality of the director and the writer, for a war movie to, I guess, sell well, there has to be like at least some kind of ultra violence, some kind of action. And oftentimes they put that in, and then that kind of undermines the intention of the war movie. It's also it's best represented with the phenomena of Starship Troopers. It is a anti-fascist film. Starship Troopers deliberately is created as an anti-fascist work, not the book itself, but the actual movie. Okay? And yet there are a million people that just kind of watch it as like, oh, they're killing all these bugs. That's kind of funny, whatever. And then there are people who actually watch it and go, oh, this is pro military. I go so far as to say that like the over-the-top jingoistic sentiment, the chauvinism, the inhumanity, like all of that is oftentimes people take a back seat. Like people's reception of the work, the actual intention of the work takes a back seat because there is a lot of like cool scenes. Zone of Interest is pro-Nazi, I feel. What? No. What? Zone of Interest was written, and first of all, Zone of Interest is a book. And the depiction is directed by a person who is a direct descendant of Holocaust survivors. And there is not a single aspect of that movie that is pro-Nazi. I was going to use Zone of Interest as a great example of like, a movie that leaves nothing on the table. To be fair, I've seen valid criticism that even if it's anti-fascist, the amount of screen time given to those ideas is so limited that it fails its goal of being anti-fascist. No, because then I also run into the other problem, which is making things specifically so that there's no subtlety, making art less subtle so that like everyone gets the point. It's not supposed to be a lecture. It's show, don't tell. Okay? So I want artists to be able to demonstrate their fucking vision without constantly trying to make agitated propaganda. Okay? Just because the broad audience has no media literacy skills and no way of like critically examining the work and basically looks at it and says, oh, this right here is what you see is what you get. So Top Gun is pro-war? Yes, of course Top Gun is pro-war. What are you talking about? It is overtly pro-war. That's not what we're talking about. I don't think anybody hides that Top Gun is pro-war. It's like it is a franchise created directly to like, you know, get more people to sign up to the Air Force. Top Gun is both pro-war and pro having gay sex with your best friend and not having any sort of straight sex with women, no matter how hard they try. Like literally, that's a very important part of Top Gun. A lot of people forget that it is absolutely about having homosexual sex with your besties, your guy friends. Yeah, it is Air Force propaganda. Anyway, my point is, what do? Do you make anti-war movies that don't have any sort of like glorified depictions of ultra violence? Like, do you urge artists to put forth a more blunt, more obvious, less subtle way of doing advocacy and just like trying to make things more boring and educational? I feel like that is awful.
And I think there's a lot of films that claim to be anti-war that really fall victim to this. In fact, some of these films I really, really love. It saddens me to say it, but films like Saving Private Ryan, Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now, Paths of Glory, and Dunkirk all lose their impact as anti-war films because fundamentally, they glorify it. Let's take a look at Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, for example. Now, this is one of my all-time favorite films.
Me too.
And for the longest time, I saw Full Metal Jacket as the
Shit fucked me up when I was a kid, dude. Shit fucked me up when I was a kid. I was like, damn, I think it was the first time I realized why they have like rating systems in place. Because when I saw Private Pile blow his shit up, I was like, as a child, okay, as a young boy, I think I was like 12 or 13 or something. I was like, oh, fuck, I don't think I was supposed to see this. Like, I literally still remember I watched it on VHS, I think. If I'm not misremembering, I might have been a DVD. But literally, when I watched it, I was like, oh my God, I don't think I'm supposed to see. I think like in something unlocked in my mind where I was like, I'm pretty sure I will never be the same again after this moment.
Embodiment of the anti-war genre, but it really isn't. The dehumanizing first and second halves of Full Metal Jacket definitely don't intend to paint a flattering picture of military life. Yet, R. Lee Ermey's abusive drill sergeant has become somewhat of a folk hero, and the 1,000-yard stare has come to signify badassery rather than an unwashable stain on one's soul. The action meant to simulate the dread and misery of war instead becomes riveting and addictive. So if none of these films are anti-war films, then what is? In 1998, whilst promoting his film Saving...
That's why when you do anti-war flicks, if you can't do any anti-war flicks, you can only cover war from the side that is just. Okay? That's why the real like way to solve this problem is covering Vietnam from the perspective of the Vietnamese, not the South Vietnamese government, but straight up from the North Vietnamese, from the perspective of Ho Chi Minh. You talk about Band of Brothers, you talk about Saving Private Ryan, that's fine. That's the right side. Okay? So if you do a flick about Vietnam, you got to cover it from the perspective of the Vietnamese who were fighting against the American invaders. I'm just saying. It's called Star Wars. They already did that. It's literally called Star Wars, one of the most fucking famous franchises that America has ever created. Very openly and very intentionally, George Lucas said, I saw the Vietnam War and I wanted to make something from the perspective of the Vietnamese. That's what it's called. Except it failed to get that message across because Americans literally don't understand that they are the villains in that story. And also, I'll take it one step further. I've heard stories of like Navy cruisers playing the fucking Imperial Death March, openly adopting the villain role.
Private Ryan. Steven Spielberg took opposition to Truffaut's comments. In fact, he stated the complete opposite. Any war movie, good or bad, is an anti-war movie. I don't think what Spielberg is saying here is right, but I think to disprove
I don't agree with that, by the way. I definitely don't agree with Spielberg's
comments. We need to look at what exactly defines an anti-war film. And to do that, let's take a look at what many people consider the definitive anti-war film. Elem Klimov's Come and See. The film throws us into the abyss of World War II through the eyes of Floria, a Belarusian teenager eager to join the fight against the Nazis. But Come and See transcends the genre by wielding its visceral violence not for entertainment, but as a searing indictment of war's inhumanity. The film's brutality is unrelenting. Klimov doesn't shy away from depicting the unimaginable. Burning villages, mass executions, and the psychological
I gotta watch this.
Torment inflicted on civilians are shown with a horrifying intimacy.
Jesus
This
Christ.
unflinching portrayal is born from Klimov's personal experiences. Klimov is a survivor of the Battle of Stalingrad. As a child, he and his family escaped the city by crossing the Volga in a makeshift raft. Having seen the devastation of war firsthand, he refused to sanitize it for the screen. Come and See doesn't portray war as the grand conquest for a just cause. It's about the...
They're saying it's free to watch on YouTube. I might do a fucking... I might do it. I might do a Moby night. It'll fuck you up, dude. Yeah, the full film is available on YouTube for free. Fucking devastating. Yeah, I might do it.
The erosion
Don't
of
test
innocence. Floria, initially wide-eyed with naive patriotism, transforms into a hollow shell. His youthful spirit is completely devoured by the carnage around him. This is where Come and See's anti-war message transcends other films. It doesn't offer catharsis through victory or the comfort of clear heroes and villains. Here, everyone is a victim caught in a maelstrom of violence.
Little bro. You know, like, movie depictions of ultra violence is not a terms of service violation because it's fake. It's real gore that is actually a terms of service violation, unless it's a depiction of nudity. If there's a lot of like real nudity, then yes, you can't show that. But you can show fake blood. What are you talking about?
The film forces us to confront the true cost of war, not just in the lives that have been lost, but in the fracturing of humanity itself. This is why I think Come and See serves as a perfect benchmark for creating a criteria that defines whether a film is truly anti-war. So here's my criteria. Number 1.
Oh yeah, if there's some sexual violence, then yeah, you can't. I don't think you can show that.
The film should avoid portraying war as a noble or heroic endeavor. Instead, it should focus on the senselessness and moral ambiguity of conflict. Number 2. The film must depict the widespread devastation caused by war, including the impact on civilians, soldiers, and the environment. Number 3. The film should be informed by the personal experiences of those who have lived through war, providing an authentic and unflinching perspective. And off the top of my head, I can only think of 2 other films that conform to this. Firstly is Larisa Shepitko's The Ascent, based on a novel by Belarusian writer Vasyl Bykov. The film is set during World War II and follows 2 Soviet partisans as...
I don't know if I agree with this because the defense of the Soviet Union wasn't a pointless war. No, I think the point of it is, if something is supposed to be anti-war, then I think like... I think the idea is that like if you're a full-blown humanist, if you're a full-blown like maximalist when it comes to being a anti-war humanist, then your attitude is supposed to be that like any violence is bad, and that there is a lot of moral ambiguity in war, in the ways in which people fight. Like if you're a full-blown pacifist, that's where you're supposed to. That's your approach conceptually to war. The difference, however, is that not many people are actually like that. I'm certainly not like that. I think that there is a concept of just war. Yes, I think that defensive actions taken against those who are fighting are just. The issue is everybody claims that their actions are defensive. You know what I mean? The reality of the matter, however, is that even just wars are still horrifying and end up taking away the humanity of those who participate in it on either side.
They struggle to survive whilst evading Nazi capture. The Ascent portrays the internal and external struggles of its characters without resorting to heroic tropes. The film's focus is on the moral dilemmas faced by the protagonists, highlighting the complexity and futility of their situation. The film vividly depicts the physical and psychological toll of war, with its harsh, snow-covered landscape serving as a powerful metaphor for the desolation and despair spread by conflict. Larisa Shepitko's father was a high-ranking officer in the military. When talking about her childhood, this is what she had to say. "My father fought all through the war. To me, the war was one of the most powerful early impressions. I remember feeling upset. The family separated. I remember hunger and how our mother and us were evacuated. The impression of a global calamity certainly left an indelible mark on my mind." The next film that conforms to this criteria is Masaki Kobayashi's Human Condition trilogy. Masaki Kobayashi's Human Condition trilogy is a sprawling exploration of the...
My dad is a devout pacifist Christian, but seems to think the Korean War was the closest thing to a just war. Is that just ignorance? Yes. It's not just like any... That is like that is an incredibly ignorant position. Like, it is completely unacceptable. It's wildly ignorant and completely unacceptable. You should show your dad my coverage over the Korean War from a couple days prior. I think it was on Saturday where I talked about the Korean War and talked about like the development of the authoritarian, brutal dictatorship in South Korea that the American government propped up and also militarily defended, both in the lead up to the Korean War and the genocidal actions that America engaged in the Korean War, and then in the aftermath of the Korean War as well. Yeah. Even if you're on the right side during a just war, you commit heinous acts of depravity. Britain was on the right side in World War II, yet they genocided millions of Bengali. America was on the right side of World War II, yet they murdered countless civilians in Dresden and Hiroshima. Exactly.
Human cost of war. The trilogy follows Kaji, a pacifist and socialist, as he navigates the horrors of World War II and its aftermath. The trilogy presents a stark and unflinching portrayal of the brutality and inhumanity of war. Kaji's journey is one of moral and ethical struggle, not of heroism or glory. The trilogy covers a vast range of experiences, from the labor camps to the battlefield, providing a comprehensive view of war's devastation, depicting the suffering of soldiers, prisoners, and civilians alike. Kobayashi's own experiences as a soldier who refused to fight and was subsequently imprisoned deeply influenced his work. His personal commitment to pacifism and his first-hand knowledge of war's horrors are glaringly evident throughout the trilogy. While Truffaut's assertion that there's no such thing as an anti-war film holds weight in many cases, films like Come and See, The Ascent, and the Human Condition trilogy completely challenge this notion. They demonstrate that it is possible to...
I'm not gonna lie, it is a little sad and a little suspicious, and you're right to call this out, that we do not have a single damn fucking movie that actually even broaches like being anti-war from the Western world in like the last decade. I guess, like I said, I mean, judging by his analysis, he does not consider All Quiet on the Western Front to be that. I do think All Quiet on the Western Front is a pretty solid anti-war movie. And I mean, Zone of Interest doesn't technically approach World War II. It simply talks about the German reception, the careerist German reception to the heinous acts, the heinous atrocities that they engaged in the Holocaust. So there's some. This guy wouldn't consider them to be anti-war, though, even though I would. Hacksaw Ridge is American anti-war. I haven't seen Hacksaw Ridge, so I don't know. Maybe.
Create a cinematic experience that truly conveys the horrors of war without succumbing to the allure of spectacle. However, these films are extremely rare and require a delicate balance to avoid the pitfalls that Truffaut was warning against. Ultimately, the power of these films lies in their ability to make us pause and reflect more deeply on war's horrific nature and the senselessness of it all, and how dangerous it actually is to glorify it. Thanks for watching the video, and be sure to subscribe. If you want to see more content like this, then support the channel by heading over to our Patreon page, where you'll get exclusive access to behind-the-scenes content, early access to videos.
Hell yeah! This was a great YouTube. This was a great YouTube video. You should get the filmmakers of No Other Land on stream, a film about Palestinian displacement made before October 7th is getting awards all over the place, probably getting an Oscar nom. In case you want to watch later, fantastic video about how Americans became such gun-loving perverts. Yeah, I feel like people have brought this channel up before. Horses. I will watch this actually.
All Horses videos are available ad-free, uncensored, and 1 week early on Patreon. Patrons also get exclusive videos and 20% off the Horses store. Check it out at patreon.com/horsespt. Compared to similar countries, America is a violent place. In America, people die violent deaths at a much higher rate than in other rich capitalist countries. This violence has expressed itself in a number of ways throughout history, but guns are currently and have always been part of the American language of violence. This video is not intended to prescribe some solution for American gun violence. I will not advocate for gun rights or for gun control in this essay. Instead, this video will identify in an objective way why America seems to have a genetic, unending, and unstoppable fondness for firearms. The first thing we should determine is simple. Do Americans actually love guns? The answer here is complicated. According to the Pew Research Center, only 32% of Americans say they actually own a gun. This stat alone would indicate that perhaps Americans don't actually love guns as much as we may believe. But when we dig further into these statistics, we get a more comprehensive version of the truth. Despite a statistical ambivalence about gun ownership, Americans have more guns per capita than any other country in the world by a large margin. Per 100 residents, America has about 120 guns. The next highest country is Yemen with about 53. So, within the context of the globe, yes, we can say that Americans relatively do love guns. The majority of Americans do believe that gun ownership is a right. Depending on whose statistics you look to, this support ranges from just over 50% to over 70%. Loving guns isn't inherently bad, but among high-income countries, America has the 7th highest rate of gun homicides. The countries that are ahead of America, though, are small nations with whom America probably can't be compared. Panama, the Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, to name a few. Notably, 2 of the countries that America trails are American territories, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. When we compare American homicide by gun rates with our global peers, America is an outlier. Among high-income countries with populations over 10 million, America is first with 4.52 gun homicides per 100,000 people. Saudi Arabia is a distant second. Canada has 0.62. The UK has 0.01. All of this put together can lead to a reasonable and objective conclusion. America leads the world by some margin in gun violence. But still, Americans love guns. So here we arrive at the core of this video. Why? Data can provide us with a contemporary but perhaps shallow answer to this question. Recent statistics show that 67% of gun owners have a gun for protection, 38% for hunting, 30% for sport shooting, 13% as part of a gun collection, and 8% for their job. On an individual level, these are reasonable justifications, but this data doesn't really tell us how or why guns have become so ingrained in American culture. The French have wine, Canadians have hockey, in much the same way Americans have guns. Why is this? Perhaps unsurprisingly, America's affinity for guns started a long, long time ago. When early colonists arrived in North America, they found Native Americans who were no strangers to violent conflict. However, these colonists brought with them a technology that would make conquering the New World fairly straightforward. That technology was...
This is the Neo-Confucianism. We must go back to Neo-Confucianism of America. Okay? Which is, I mean, it's great. I like it so far. I like it a lot so far. Once again, the channel is called Horses, and the video is called Why America, in parentheses, Still Loves Guns.
Was, of course, the rifle. The colonists realized their rifles gave them an immense advantage over the native people, so colonial leaders mandated gun ownership. In 1658, Virginia required that, quote, every man able to bear arms have in his house a fixed gun. Around this time, Plymouth County also instated a similar law requiring every male to own a gun. This law would shortly thereafter be extended to the entirety of Massachusetts. At the time, these weapons were primarily intended to attack and defend against Native Americans. In his book The Barbarous Years, historian Bernard Bailyn notes that there was one group, Europeans, using violence to assert its will over another group, Native Americans. This basically set the precedent that violence, specifically gun violence, was a legitimate method of settling disputes and enacting one's own will in America. And sure enough, colonists began settling their own disputes with violence. Rates of European on European violence rose during this period. So perhaps it could even be an understatement to say that America was founded on violence. America was from its very beginning steeped in gun violence. Certainly conquering land is different than shooting up a school, but the point remains. Since Europeans arrived, America has had violence through the use of firearms. As America moved into the Revolutionary War, we see the evolution of America's gun culture. We shouldn't go so far as to say the Revolutionary War happened over the right to own guns. The British made some haphazard attempts at confiscating American guns, but this was not the driving force of the revolution. In reality, the revolution came from issues over taxes and representation in British government. But in any case, we won the Revolutionary War by using guns. Without firearms, today there would likely be no United States of America. This is an important thing to remember as we discuss the country's ongoing cultural love for guns. Following the war, early colonists still had fresh memories of British troops and their treatment of American citizens. With this in mind, America and its leaders were not too keen on the idea of a standing American army. Quite the opposite. The idea of a national army was seen as antithetical to American liberty. However, the Founding Fathers did recognize that some type of military might would be necessary to keep the peace. So they set out to protect the private citizens' rights to organizing militias. Gun ownership is pointedly discussed within America's Bill of Rights. The Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Both gun rights and gun control activists often claim that the Second Amendment is written in clear language. Both sides will proclaim that this amendment clearly supports their own argument. Indeed, when we examine this amendment, things can become confusing quite quickly. First of all, we have simple grammatical syntax. The English language has changed since this was written. Today, the sentence is difficult to parse. If we examine it only in form, as purely a grammatical exercise, the Second Amendment is difficult to understand. What do all of these commas mean? What exactly shouldn't be infringed? The militia or the guns themselves? To the modern reader,
You might think that this is fucking boring. Okay. And I'm hearing some dumbasses in the chat saying similar things. But it is objectively important to understand how we arrived at this interpretation. So yes, unfortunately, language does play a very important role here. Every dumbass American points to the Second Amendment, whether in favor or against. And I hope that he will talk about the interpretation of the Second Amendment changing throughout time as well, because it's something that I routinely point to. My story about American guns, like American gun violence and American gun culture and its evolution throughout time, my hypothesis doesn't start in the inception of the Second Amendment, but instead, it starts with the Vietnam War. The way I interpret the situation is that in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, there was a surplus of weapons of war, and these, capitalist gun manufacturers wanted to find a new market for them. They wanted to dump their surplus, because waging war with these small arms was not enough. And it was the AR-15, the inception of the AR-15 was a fantastic invention, because it wasn't just a gun. It was also a gun with a lot of specs, a lot of customization options. So it created massive secondary market opportunities as well. I think that this plays a big role in how the AR-15 became the most popular weapon why it became the most popular weapon, and how the Second Amendment interpretation changed throughout time alongside this.
The Second Amendment is not written very clearly. After all, if it was, there certainly wouldn't be so much debate about it. The meanings of words have also changed in ways that can enhance arguments for either side of the issue. Take the word regulated. Pulitzer Prize-winning constitutional scholar Jack Rakove says that in the 18th century, regulated did not mean subjected to laws or government restrictions. Rather, it meant that the militia would be armed, organized, and properly effective. So we could take this interpretation to mean the Second Amendment does not endorse government regulation of firearms. But then there's the phrase bear arms. Saul Cornell is another leading constitutional scholar who is considered one of the foremost authorities on Revolutionary-era legal thinking. Cornell has indicated that the right to bear arms had almost nothing to do with personal self-defense in revolutionary America. At the time, firearms were not considered tools for self-defense, they were military objects. Edged weapons and blunt objects were more in line with the idea of self-defense. To use a gun for defending oneself would have been like using a hatchet to cut vegetables. It would work, but the idea was just kind of outlandish. So this interpretation seems to indicate that the Second Amendment doesn't protect the right to gun ownership. Rakove and Cornell are both equally esteemed and qualified constitutional scholars, and each of them can lead us down different paths with the Second Amendment. These are just two examples, but there are endless more. Modern America has not been able to reach a conclusion on the Second Amendment because a lot of intelligent, qualified individuals have wildly differing interpretations of the text. Even the federal interpretation of the Second Amendment has swung wildly throughout time. For decades and decades, courts agreed that the Second Amendment did not protect individual rights to gun ownership. Rather, early Americans read the Second Amendment as protecting the existence of militias. However, in 2008, Supreme Court justices declared that the Second Amendment does in fact protect the right to individual gun ownership. Even still, this decision came with its fair share of conditions. Justice Antonin Scalia noted that firearms were subject to restrictions and regulations. The point of all of this is not to come to a conclusion on constitutional law. There are a lot of other Second Amendment stones I have left unturned here, and that is intentional. It is not my desire to advocate for any particular reading of the amendment, but rather we can take all of this to understand two things. First, the Founding Fathers believed that people should be allowed to keep rifles at home. This is included in the Bill of Rights. Second, America has never really known what to do about this. The Second Amendment has continuously been interpreted and reinterpreted as the basis for wildly divergent opinions and pieces of legislation. As we move forward past the 18th century, America's gun culture truly begins to take shape. In the mid-19th century, guns were still not seen as instruments of violence. Instead, they were tools. They were more shovel than sword. This was perhaps in part because they just didn't work very well. These guns were clunky, unreliable, inaccurate, and generally troublesome tools. But then a young man named Samuel Colt got to work. Around this time, Texans were fighting against the Comanche tribe. More accurately, they were trying to kill off the Comanches entirely. After hearing a remarkable battle story from a Texan named Sam Walker, Colt realized that firearms could have some romance about them. They could be more than tools. Guns could have some emotional meaning. So Samuel Colt began a massive marketing campaign. He associated his guns with the so-perceived bravery of defending America against foreigners and Native Americans alike. Just as early colonists had, Colt framed violence as a premier strategy for settling disputes. Samuel Colt sent free merchandise to politicians. He circulated pamphlets. He hired a famous painter to depict scenes of Colt guns saving American lives. Other firearms manufacturers soon followed suit. They all focused their efforts on handguns, which could be produced quite cheaply in America. For a long time, guns had been prohibitively expensive. That was no longer the case. Manufacturers like Colt made cheaper and cheaper handguns. In 1850, a Colt revolver was $12. By the year 1900, a .22 caliber Colt could be had for 18 cents. The country also had fewer restrictions on firearms than Europe, which alone incentivized gun ownership. People could, so they would. These newer, smaller guns were also quite convenient. They were more reliable than past firearms and could be neatly tucked away into the belt line. Combine all of this with an effective marketing campaign, and firearms like the new Colts were immensely successful. These guns made it easier to kill people. Strangling or beating a person to death brought an immense amount of risk. You could get hit back. There's also a lot of thought that had to occur before, during, and after such an act. Rifles were too cumbersome and bulky to carry around on one's person. There were essentially barriers to entry as far as violence was concerned, but handheld revolvers and handguns broke these down entirely. Now within a second or two, you could kill a man without a whole lot of effort, psychological or physical. During the 14 years when these changes were happening, firearms ownership ballooned to 10 times what it had been at the turn of the century. This reality was occurring against an increasingly violent backdrop. As the country hurled itself towards a civil war, America was becoming more and more homicidal. With the proliferation of slavery, there arose a new group which Americans desired to control. Taking cues from their forefathers, slave owners and other Americans used widely available firearms to control African slaves. Homicide rates skyrocketed across the nation in a time that is often called the riot era. Alongside this, increasing industrialization was making American cities more bountiful and more populated. This surge in productivity required more labor, so immigrants began to pour into America's largest cities. They were met with rampant xenophobia, which often translated to violence. Some American political parties declared that these immigrants, Scottish, Irish, and German, would bring with them violence, and that increased immigration meant increased danger for Americans. All of this, the violence and the proliferation of firearms, just spread and spread. The American West became the Wild West as prospectors clashed with Native Americans.
It's so funny that any point, this is why I say America's a proto-capitalist nation before people even understood what capitalism was. But at every single point throughout American history, the same through lines are right there. The same problems persist. The same issues are right there for every single person. Again and again and again. It's incredible. Even gun violence and its starting point still comes from the mass availability of guns and how much the gun manufacturer, Colt, in that circumstance, made it a formative part of your identity. That issue still very much exists. Is at the heart of what I talk about with respect to commodity fetishization and how guns, a commodity, are treated not only as a cultural signifier. When you own a gun, you're a gun owner, but also a political movement. You're part of an in-group of like-minded individuals that make political choices and decisions specifically at the behest of protecting your hobby, your commodity.
So across the entire country in the late 1800s, American violence was again in its ascendancy. Gun violence had worked for the colonists, it had worked for the revolutionaries, so now it was working for post-Civil War Western prospectors, Southern Americans, and xenophobic urbanites. These conflicts all reflect an idea that guns should be used to settle disputes. It is this idea which is perhaps at the core of America's gun culture. So for decades, that was exactly what happened. In the 1900s, America just got more and more homicidal. In 1900, the homicide rate was roughly 1 per 100,000 people. By 1930, it was almost 10 per 100,000 people. Much of this was due to gun violence surrounding prohibition and organized crime. America was in a sort of Tommy gun era, and its impacts were devastating. And so, we come to the next major force in America's gun culture, the NRA. By the 20s, the NRA had already been around for some 50-odd years. The group was originally founded to increase marksmanship abilities. For decades.
Yeah. The NRA in its inception is actually created by the North. It's created by a New York Times journalist. Okay? It originally starts because the well-armed, the heavily armed Confederate states are able to put up a strong defense against the law enforcement authority of the Union. So the goal is to basically teach people how to properly use guns if there's ever a necessity to use them again. Okay? That's what it originally started as. And I believe it was I believe it was started by a New York Times journalist, and like I think it was a not a freed slave, but I think it was a black dude as well.
Decades, they mostly
I'm sure he'll
organized
bring it
shooting
up.
competitions. But after the Great Depression, the NRA began to drift into the political sphere. Their goal, though, was
But okay, he doesn't bring it up. So in its inception, it was to train Northerners to be able to properly handle a firearm and learn how to shoot it. Then it became a hunting club. It was purely for sport. The NRA basically was a sporting institution. Okay? And it is actually relatively recent in the history of the NRA where it became this like massively consequential, overtly powerful political operation that operates on the boundaries of the material interests and the for-profit interests of gun manufacturers, that actively harms the American legislative body with its influence.
not the loosening of restrictions. Often the opposite was true. In the early
Yeah.
20s, the NRA successfully pushed for increased firearms regulation, hoping
Yep.
to ensure that only respectable, serious individuals could own guns. President Roosevelt signed two pieces of legislation which regulated commercial firearms sales: the 1934 National Firearms Act and the 1938 Federal Firearms Act. These two acts imposed paid registration on some weapons and federal registration for gun dealers. They also prohibited felons from purchasing guns at all. The NRA convinced Congress to exclude handguns from this new legislation, but broadly supported the bills. In 1934, the NRA president said in a testimony to Congress, "I do not believe in the general promiscuous toting of guns. I think it should be sharply restricted and only under licenses." The NRA began to change, though, when a new wave of violence came to America. After the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a wave of riots spread across Baltimore. There emerged an increasing level of anxiety and violence around the civil rights movement. Richard Nixon was elected president as a law and order candidate. One of his first moves was to militarize urban police forces with heavier weaponry. And so Nixon continued these traditions of guns and violence being used to control a disobedient group and to settle conflict in America. Gun violence went again on the upswing. Gun homicides increased sharply by 51%. Assaults using firearms rose even more by an astounding 84%. Guns were also becoming cheaper. Inexpensive handguns were being imported from overseas like never before. In 1955, 67,000 handguns were imported to the U.S. In 1968, that number increased to about 1 million. At this time, the NRA was still firmly on the side of gun control. In 1968, NRA President Harold Glasson said in a lecture, "Does the right to keep and bear arms mean that every individual has a right to carry a gun at all times, concealed or openly? Obviously not." This same year, the U.S. government passed the Gun Control Act of 1968, prompted by the assassination of President Kennedy. However, the conservative movement in America was beginning to change dramatically. Increasingly, conservatives saw any and all government regulation as inherently problematic. Conservatives placed more and more value on personal freedoms. People like Barry Goldwater, Jerry Falwell, and Howard Jarvis pushed legislation under this new anti-government sentiment. The NRA was a conservative organization, and so they too underwent a seismic shift, almost overnight. In the 1970s, a man named Harlan Carter was an increasingly vocal member of the NRA. He took a hardline stance, believing that no amount of firearms legislation was acceptable. When asked if violent criminals and the mentally ill should be allowed to own guns, Harlan replied that it was the, quote, "price we pay for freedom." Harlan wrote a letter to NRA leadership imploring them to take his position, declaring that we can win it on a simple concept: no compromise, no gun legislation. In the mid-70s, Carter would go on to essentially lead a coup against NRA leadership. This resulted in him winning the position of executive vice president. Under Harlan's leadership, the NRA entered into an entirely new era. The new NRA spread a narrative that the US government had a secret plan to disarm all Americans. The gun, Carter said, was the sole tool for defeating this government oppression. Further, Carter's NRA leveraged rising crime rates and racial anxieties to rally support for gun rights. This was all a massive success. Membership in the NRA tripled under Carter from 1 million to 3.7 million. Carter hired a team of lobbyists and activists who racked up victories across the country. Several states under NRA guidance added the right to bear arms into their constitution.
It's so funny that you can sell Americans anything with white supremacy. You can sell Americans the idea that welfare is bad because black people use it. You can sell Americans the idea that you must rise up and bear arms by saying black people are going to kill you. You can also, ironically, sell Americans the idea that there needs to be gun control by also using black people. California is a fantastic example of this, where in the immediate aftermath of a Black Panther Party demonstrating an armed protest at the state capitol, Ronald Reagan came down with, what is it called? The Mulford Act, I believe. They immediately made it illegal to openly bear arms in public. It's so crazy.
The NRA repeatedly defeated efforts to increase gun control measures on a federal level. Even after Carter left his position in the 80s, the NRA continued to find political success. They raised $70 million for Republican House Leader Newt Gingrich, and they spread pro-gun messaging throughout important swing state elections. Near the turn of the century, the NRA capitalized on the unpopularity of Bill Clinton, tax increases, and failed government reform policies. However, as Senator Chris Murphy points out in his book, the NRA accomplished a lot after the year 2000, despite having very little actual power. The NRA did not spend a lot of money compared to other lobbyists and super PACs. In 2012, NRA endorsed candidates only won 1 out of 7 elections. During this time, there was very little statistical electoral advantage to having the NRA on your side. Bizarrely, the NRA had become an effective political force without actually having much in the way of political capability. Murphy, a politician himself, notes the phenomenon of the squeaky wheel. While a small minority of Americans support everything the NRA advocates for, the NRA encourages that minority to be as loud as possible. This, of course, skews public perception, which can result in real legislative and electoral action. The NRA also has a remarkably strong brand. For a politician, the NRA endorsement broadcasts a lot more than gun rights. It's a conservative badge of honor. Whether or not the voting population agrees with the NRA on individual policy issues, a candidate earning their endorsement can be an important piece of the electoral puzzle. Culturally, the NRA also has a significant impact among citizens. The NRA, building on centuries of tradition, continues to tie gun ownership to liberty and personal freedom. Whether or not you, personally, the viewer, agrees with this notion, it must be said, this is the angle for the NRA. They are carrying the torch of their forefathers. Like Samuel Colt, the NRA proclaims that guns are more than just objects, they are symbols of freedom. For a long time, the NRA was viewed quite favorably among Americans, and so this messaging was very successful. In recent years, though, they have begun to lose much of this cultural capital. But when we put all of this story into a pot, we get the American gun culture. Up to this point, I have omitted one perhaps large part of American gun culture: media. America is the land of media. Much of this media is very violent, and much of it includes guns. Research on the correlation between violent media consumption and violent behavior has produced mixed findings. This media is a part of the American gun culture, but if we blame violent video games, movies, and music for this culture, I think we are looking at the equation from the wrong end. After all, violent media does not just erupt out of nowhere and produce violent behavior en masse. Video games, movies, music are all created as reflections of American sensibilities. Companies produce violent media because America wants violent media. These things are part of the existing gun culture, and maybe they even exacerbate that culture. But they are not the cause of it. They are more symptoms than virus. It seems to me that America's affinity for guns comes from 3 places. It is the sum of 3 parts: tradition, rights, and mythology. In this country, we have a long-standing tradition of gun violence. The landmass was conquered through gun violence. The country itself was founded on gun violence. Time and time again, social conflicts have been solved through the means of force, often with a firearm. This macro tradition has leaked into the micro. For some Americans, guns are now a legitimate way to settle disputes or control groups of people. The right to own guns is expressed in the American Bill of Rights. The country was founded with firearms in mind in one way or the other. But due to aging language, changing times, and increasing polarization, there is little agreement on how exactly America should protect this right. Guns have a profound mythological meaning in America. In the very early days of the country, capitalists began active efforts to galvanize the mythology of guns within American culture. They were successful, and this is a process which has not stopped. Its effects have not abated. For hundreds of years, American companies and organizations have produced messaging that ties guns directly to American identity. All nations around the world have their collective cultural interests. Guns are the American incarnation of this phenomenon. Gun control activists say,
Yeah. But its inception still goes back to the material interests of gun manufacturers that want to turn a profit, that want to sell their product. When will you finally discuss Syria? Please talk about Syria. You never do. I have. There are numerous videos on Syria on my YouTube page. The last guy that came in and yelled at me for not talking about Syria came back an hour later and said, "Actually, my bad. You did cover it pretty extensively." Unless you are the same chatter. I don't think he's the same chatter.
say that something must give, that gun violence is out of control, and that we simply must act. More often than outright removal of firearms, activists often demand a compromise that takes the form of increased gun regulation. The other side says that we already have regulations in place, that they already have compromised. They point to the thousands and thousands of gun laws which already exist on federal, state, and local levels. This debate just goes on, and I'm not really sure what the path forward is, but I do think that understanding the gun within American history and mythology could be a good place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I think good video. It tackles one aspect of, like, it definitely does exactly what its stated purpose is, which is the historical context as to why Americans are so obsessed with guns.
United States of America.
Wait, what? The animated clip is great.
Hi, boys and girls, ready to get started? Once upon a time, there were these people in Europe called pilgrims, and they were afraid of being persecuted. So they all got in a boat and sailed to the New World where they wouldn't have to be scared ever again.
Oh, I'm so relaxed. I feel so much safer.
But as soon as they arrived, they were greeted by savages, and they got scared all over again. So they killed them all. Now, you'd think wiping out a race of people would calm them down, but no. Instead, they started getting frightened of each other. Witch! So they burned witches. In 1775, they started killing the British so they could be free. And it worked, but they still didn't feel safe. So they passed a Second Amendment which said every white man could keep his gun. I loves my gun. Loves my gun. Which brings us to the genius idea of slavery. You see, boys and girls, the white people back then were also afraid of doing any work. So they went to Africa, kidnapped thousands of black people, brought them back to America, and forced them to work very hard for no money. And I don't mean no money like I work at Walmart and make no money. I mean $0. Nothing. Not a zip. Doing it that way made the USA the richest country in the world. So did having all that money and free help calm the white people down? No way. They got even more afraid. That's because after 200 years of slavery, the black people now outnumbered the white people in many parts of the South. Well, you can pretty much guess what came next. The slaves started rebelling. There were uprisings, and old master's heads got chopped off. And when white people heard of this, they were freaking out and going, I want to live. Don't kill me, big black man. Well, just in the nick of time came Samuel Colt, who in 1836 invented the first weapon ever that could be fired over and over without having to reload. And all the southern whites were like, yeah! But it was too late. The North soon won the Civil War and the slaves were freed. Yep, they were free now to go chop all the old master's heads off. And everybody was like, oh no, we're gonna die. But the freed slaves took no revenge. They just wanted to live in peace. But you couldn't convince the white people of this. So they formed the Ku Klux Klan. And in 1871, the same year the Klan became an illegal terrorist organization, another group was founded, the National Rifle Association. Soon politicians passed one of the first gun laws, making it illegal for any black person to own one. It was a great year for America, the KKK and the NRA. Of course, they had nothing to do with each other, and this was just a coincidence. One group legally promoted responsible gun ownership, and the other group shot and lynched black people. And that's the way it was all the way to 1955, when a black woman broke the law by refusing to move to the back of the bus. White people just couldn't believe it. Huh?
Well, I won't say move.
What's going on? Man, all hell broke loose. Black people everywhere started demanding their rights, and white people had a major freaky feel meltdown, and they were all like, run away! Run away! And they did. They all ran fleeing to the suburbs where it was all white and safe and clean. And they went out and bought 250 million guns and put locks on the doors, alarms in the houses, and gates around the neighborhoods. And finally, they were all safe and secure and snug as a bug. And everyone lived happily ever after.
Okay, a lot of that is just it doesn't tackle the underlying material, the underlying material interest, like profit interest of the corporations that sell the guns, but rather how it was packaged and sold to a broader public by talking about it within the framework of white supremacy, which is once again a way to sell anything to the broadest American public. Anyway.